Okay, we're being recorded, Kevin. And we are talking today with Kevin Aplin. I would describe his occupation as a activist extraordinaire. And he now resides in Lagos, Portugal. And you living the retired life, but you're not really retired. So, but it seems like you're living the dream over there, Kevin.
Yeah, well, activists never fully retire. Yeah,
That's
but we have definitely taken a step back from full-time activism because as you get older, your priorities is more to relax, keep healthy, but still, when things irritate me that government does or doesn't do, I can't help myself and have to get involved, at least on a part-time basis, to change things for the better, hopefully.
That's awesome. Yeah, I feel that. I feel that desire too. Um, I have to ask you. I know that you were heavily involved in the cannabis legalization movement. How, when, and how did you get involved or attracted to that movement in the at the very.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is I've always been interested in politics, and I started off really organizing things as a union member in Scotland. I worked in a theatre, and I organized workers to demand better overtime pay and other working conditions, and organize strikes and protests. So I've always had it in me. But as far as the cannabis movement, I was living in a town called Athens, Georgia, and a friend of mine that lived there was Shan Clark, and he was one of the editors of the early editions of a book called The Emperor Wears No Clothes, which was by Jack Herrera. He was from Brooklyn originally, but was based in California. And I read that book, and Shan talked to me about some of the research they'd done to put that book together. And it, really, I was a casual pot smoker and a musician, so I always, thought it was a matter of personal choice and freedom, and it shouldn't be illegal. But I never realized the history of cannabis prohibition and why it was made illegal for various different reasons: racism, big pharma, and so forth. But anyway, in the spring of 1990, Shan and I went to a hemp rally at the University of Georgia campus in Athens, and I was invited to play music there. I had a little band, a duo really, called Straw Hat, and we performed a few songs at the rally for free, and it was quite a nice little crowd there. And we met people that were putting together this hemp tour called the Cannabisactionnetwork, and it was some ladies, Debbie Goldsberry, Monica Pratt, were the real women that founded CAN. And after our performance and talking to them, we were invited to jump on the bus with them and travel throughout the Midwest on a tour. So at spur of the moment, really, we decided, Shan and I, to go with them. And I think our first events were up in Kentucky. And that's where we met Gatewood Galbraith, a lawyer he ran for governor several times there as a Green Democrat. And, we sort of got on the bus, as it were, with a sort of a ragtag group. There was a band called Red Fly Nation, who later became Catawampus, that played at all of these different events for free. And we basically sold T-shirts, bumper stickers, hemp clothing, which was in its early days. There was very little hemp clothing, but hemp bracelets. We had these balls of twine that we could make hemp bracelets from, and we would set up at different events at university campuses, in front of courthouses, in public parks. And what I realized very quickly, that quite often we were harassed by police for having these events. Just, where's your permit? And sometimes we had a permit, sometimes we didn't. Often we said we didn't need one. And we were really heavily harassed so it sort of a group of us together learned our rights, our civil rights about free speech, First Amendment gatherings, and so forth. But we really had no money at all and relied heavily on just the kindness of each town that we went to. Had a host. It was just a phone number. This is, of course, way before cell phones. So we had maybe 3 or 4 vehicles and a little convoy of people with the equipment, PA equipment and T-shirts and literature and petitions. And we had to coordinate all that by payphones, really. Go meeting. I remember an event in Detroit. It ended up 5 or 6 vehicles all trying to find each other, and then going to an organized house in Dearborn outside of Detroit. And just how we did it, I really don't know. With nobody getting, and occasionally someone might get arrested, and we'd have to find that out. And so it was a real learning curve. We were really mostly hippies or counterculture people, because really, if you look back at the marijuana movement, it really was started in the mid to late 60s by the yippies, primarily, who did smoke-ins and love-ins, and cannabis was a part of what they were demanding as the counterculture. And there were still people I met on these first tours who were yippies. Originally, the Dana Beal from New York, Ben Maisel, and Paul Krasner, and they sort of mentored us a little bit, told their stories from the 60s. And I think the cannabis movement had been kind of in a rut through the 80s. There was nothing really changing. People were complaining, and in the 90s, it really, what we did, I remember going to 77 cities in less than 100 days. And what we did was talk to 1 or 2 people in each town that agreed to put their name on a permit or to show up with some friends. And we gave them information, got their phone numbers, and kept in touch. And the events gradually grow a bit bigger and a bit bigger. And we, kind of learned to deal with the media a little bit, because we would send out press conferences, and we made a lot of mistakes at first. Punctuality was a thing, because we didn't have cell phones and our vehicles would break down and things like that. So sometimes we were late, and that made me furious, because I'm very much a punctual, on time type of person. And so, but we gradually got better and better, making sure we were on time and planning our events far enough apart that we weren't late, and so forth. And, learning about how to handle media that were sometimes friendly and sometimes hostile. Trying to do that, and that's part of how we evolved through the 90s to do things like media trainings that we learned from ourselves and from other organizations. There were literally hundreds of cannabis organizations that developed through the 90s all over the country, because local people wanted to have perhaps their own names. Some of them were normal chapters, National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Laws. Some of them were their own names, like the Texas Hemp Council, THC. And that was formed out of a tactic called civil disobedience, that organization. And so there's so much to talk about, it's hard to condense it.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask you, though. I wanted to say that you mentioned that the cannabis legalization movement kind of stalled in the 80s. And I had previously interviewed Keith Straub with Normal, and he said something of the same thing. And I wanted to ask you if you think that the injection of medical marijuana, the idea of medical marijuana, and basically as a result of the AIDS epidemic and the LGBT community getting involved in it, do you think that sparked the creation of these hundreds of grassroots network? Is that the spark that the cannabis movement needed at that time?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure medical marijuana itself did, but certainly there's no question that medical marijuana became the issue that gained the support of the public at large. There's no question that people like Dennis Perrone in San Francisco. He had, cannabis stores and was supplying people with HIV in the Castro neighborhood of San Francisco. His Proposition P in the 90s was the first place where cannabis was legal for medical purposes in the city of San Francisco. It passed with almost 80% of the vote. And that was really a catalyst for other cities to start looking at their local laws. Now, of course, it was still illegal under federal law. But I think there's no doubt in my mind, people in every community that were using cannabis for medical purposes, by the movement reaching out to them and them coming forward to talk to the media, it was very hard, even for conservatives, to argue against the fact that someone had a personal right to help improve their medical condition and extend their lives if they had, whether they had cancer and going through chemotherapy treatments, the cannabis helped relieve their nausea, whether it was an AIDS patient, someone with multiple sclerosis or ALS. It's very hard for any member of the public to sort of look these people in the face, hear about their story and say they belong in jail. Because that's what the policy was. If you used cannabis in any amount, it was a crime in many states, still a quite serious crime, which involved jail time. So I think that was the issue that definitely attracted the most public sympathy and attention, and started to change the numbers. But someone had to go out there and tell everybody about the science. And we had several doctors, Dr. John Morgan, Lester Grinspoon, many others, that agreed to come, not usually to rallies to speak, but they would come to courts if there was a case involving a medical patient. And for example, in Florida, there was a big famous case, the Jenks, a couple living with HIV, and they managed to get a precedent set. And that was only because of pro bono lawyers coming in to help and doctors with peer-reviewed studies coming to testify in a court of law. And those precedents were then publicized, and people could use, we as Cannabis Action Network took this information and spread it all over the country so that people in other states could start to talk about the information, to maybe organize and get a patient to come forward and start a court case, or start a petition initiative to get something on the ballot. And that's where we had the combination of grassroots activism. Like I said, it started with a ragtag group of people in vans with t-shirts, but then you coordinating that information and getting lawyers to step forward and taking it into legislatures in Capitol buildings. And we learned to dress a little different. When we were on the road, you dress in your jeans and your pot t-shirt, and it's very casual, and that's fine. But then we learned, going up, if you wanted to talk to the governor or a member of the legislature, better to not necessarily a suit and tie, but dress smartly and be on time and have the information in front of you that you talk to. And it gradually, bit by bit, you gain more and more political support.
So not only was there, you were battling the disinformation, the incorrect non-empirical studies and anecdotal evidence against using marijuana, but you also had to battle this idea the public had about people who used pot, they were, lazy hippies that couldn't be on time like you're talking about, or didn't dress like other people in society,
Precisely. And we learned very quickly, we used to send out at the beginning press releases, come to the hemp rally. It'll happen at, high noon at the plaza in front of the courthouse. And the press would all show up, especially local TV. And we learned very quickly, we have to designate a spokesperson or one or two spokespeople for the event so that the press could look for that person, ask for that person. And those people would be trained, hopefully, in was a local person or one of the touring people on talking points, what we call talking points, where you have basically, if you're on television, we learned that what the media will show as a clip from an event, whether it's a protest or a rally, is about 15 seconds or so. And then they'll move on to another clip of another person, that may be against legalization. And we learned to talk in 15-second to 20-second pieces, so they couldn't really edit you, or because if you say something stupid, that you can be sure that some of the media would purposefully use the worst comment about it. So we got more savvy as it went on. We made a lot of mistakes at first where we looked bad on television. We did look stereotypical, but we learned, and at least we were the ones willing to put our butts on the line, because let me tell you, these rallies, it wasn't a matter of just getting a permit and showing up. We were denied permits. People were arrested for just speaking about marijuana, let alone changing the laws.
Right.
Just to even have an event, we were threatened by police and mayors. No, we don't want these people in our town. It's illegal. And we had to obviously, fight that, because no matter what you think of cannabis or any other issue, people have a right to peaceably assemble in the United States. And it was amazing to me how much we had to fight and learn about those First Amendment rights and Fourth Amendment rights to not be searched just because we were attending a rally. So there was a lot of other things that eventually I ended up spending a lot more time later in my activism with the American Civil Liberties Union, dealing with broader issues of civil rights, and especially the treatment of minorities and the war on drugs as a whole. And I think that now I see people still fighting for criminal justice reform, but I think a lot of that came out of these movements, these early cannabis movements, people realizing how much discrimination there was to people just speaking about it, and especially the targeting of minority communities for these laws. And that's still happening today.
Right. So there was a huge intersection of, you had sick people that were being jailed, you had hippies that were being jailed, and you had people of color that were being jailed, all because of bogus facts and bogus information. Do you think that moral outrage, that whole combination of things that couldn't be supported by science, that is maybe what turned the public, even those who didn't smoke marijuana, as you mentioned earlier, or didn't care about marijuana?
Yeah, there were definitely some people, like there's a libertarian mindset, of course, that people should be able to put what they want in their own bodies. But I also think a lot of taxpayers that maybe had smoked marijuana in college, but then they don't smoke anymore, but they didn't want their tax dollars going to keep nonviolent people in jail when they saw other crimes of violence. And the jail situation in the United States, over millions and millions incarcerated, and this is a way to maybe empty some of those jail cells for people that actually might belong there. And especially the discrimination of the targeting of people. They could see it was a certain strategic thing for the police to go into certain neighborhoods especially in urban areas, and just target people for cannabis, while they weren't looking in the back of somebody's Porsche or BMW in white communities for cannabis necessarily. So there was a clear unfairness to it that we helped to point out, I hope. And the whole Reagan thing of the 80s, just say no on drugs, led to disastrous consequences for many minority communities who had their lives turned upside down for small amounts of cannabis, and couldn't get jobs, couldn't go to college, and it was just not a productive thing for society as a whole. So I think a lot of people that weren't necessarily stoners saw that it was a waste of police resources, and also a way for police to use discriminatory tactics.
You mentioned earlier that sometimes when you engage the media, some of them were friendly and some of them weren't. When you first started engaging the media, what would you say at that point? It was mostly oppositional or adversarial, and did things get better over time as you reached out and and maybe changed your image a little bit to do more professional tactics?
Yeah, definitely, because the attitude, especially of the television media, for sure, was this is a joke. These are old hippies, and they just want to get stoned, and they can't, they've got long hair, they're not, and they've got the munchies, it was all these stereotypes, and they just wanted to make fun of it. It wasn't really necessarily opposition. It was just, let's make fun of this cannabis rally and not take it seriously at all. So our job was to really learn to get the facts into those sound bites and to those reporters, give them a whole bunch of information for them to read. And even if though it was a 2-minute piece, a joke piece, then those reporters would read that information. Some of them did. The print media was a little different because you had time to sort of give quotes and have a more lengthy process than on a camera. So you could actually sit down with like a reporter from the Associated Press, or in a big city, one of the big dailies, the Chicago Tribune or Miami Herald, and you could get more in depth with them. And if you did it in a way that you had all of the sources for your information that they could rely on, they could check, then you could get some of that into print. So I found the print media was a bit easier. And then we did a lot of radio as well, which of course is a longer format. If you're on a whole 1-hour show or even a 15-minute piece, you could get to say a lot more. Television was the most difficult. But hey, back then, everybody tuned into the local news at 5:30 or 6. It was a different media landscape than now, where everything's streaming, and people don't pay attention so much to their local, and a lot of local newspapers don't exist anymore.
That's true. That's true.
It's a different thing. We could reach literally a whole town or city by getting good articles in 1 or 2 newspapers, and that made a big difference.
I was going to ask you about that. Why was it important to engage the media? What purpose did media engagement and promotion serve for the movement?
Right. Well, first of all, it took a courage for people in the early 90s and throughout the 90s to show up to a rally. Many people that supported us maybe had full-time jobs somewhere, so they couldn't show up when our rally took place, or they were afraid to be seen at one by the police, because photographs were taken of people at rallies. And if you were perhaps a doctor or even a plumber, you might lose business, and people were afraid to come to the event. So the media could get that message out to the people, and then they could read for themselves what happened, and perhaps then later come and ask for some petitions privately. And so I think it was just a way we had to reach people more than that could attend the rallies. Really, some of these rallies, we would show up, it would be 15 or 20 people would come. And then others, we got in bigger cities, we got celebrities started to become involved through the help of High Times magazine, who followed us around for a while. As a journalist, Steve Bloom, who used to write for them, he came on a whole hemp tour with us. And so that got sort of some national publicity in High Times magazine, and celebrities wanted to be in that magazine. So I tell you a story about the Black Crows. A colleague of mine were setting up a little hemp booth in a pub in Kentucky, in Lexington. And 2 members of the Black Crows came into the pub. They were playing the next night on a bill with ZZ Top. And they loved the hemp shirts we had and the pot t-shirts. And they sort of spent about $100 at our table, and then gave us backstage passes. Did you come to the show? So we went to the show, talked to them on their tour bus. I gave them a free copy of The Emperor Wears No Clothes. And I said, here, with this t-shirt, you wear it at some sort of concert. And Chris Robinson, the singer, then wore one of our Cannabis Action Network t-shirts at the MTV Awards. And that created, the MTV talked about it, that he was wearing that shirt, and they sort of censored it out. The pot leaf on the shirt, MTV actually put a blurb over it so they couldn't see the shirt, and that created a whole censorship controversy. So it backfired on MTV because it created more interest in it. And then they agreed to play a free concert in Atlanta and 50,000 people came because they had other people on the bill. And so we were able to reach and raise funds. More importantly, those bigger events, you reached a lot of people, but you were able to literally through selling t-shirts and donations. Very critical if you're a grassroots organizer to have several things on your table. If you're at any event, you must always have a volunteer sign-up sheet to have contact with people. Nowadays, it would be email or social media contacts, but then it was your phone number and possibly an email later into the 90s. And also have a donation jar so that people that want to contribute to gas money, to printing costs, that they can. And a petition, if possible. If there's something, initiative that is started in that city or that state, always copies of a petition for people to take to their legislatures. So those are critical things to have at any event.
You mentioned celebrity involvement, lawyer involvement, doctors who supported cannabis movement. Why was that important, and what do you think drew those people into the movement?
Well, a lot of, with celebrities, a lot of artistic people, musicians, actors, painters, are creative people, and a lot of creative people going, back to the jazz musicians in the 30s and 40s used cannabis as a way to create things. Louis Armstrong back in New Orleans was a famous cannabis smoker. He said he preferred it to bourbon because it mellowed him out and he could blow the horn, and the Beatles, were turned on to cannabis by Bob Dylan. And, you can hear the sound of the Beatles change as they got into cannabis and other psychedelics. Their music got more deeper, more meaningful, and better. And so many creative people have used it, but of course it was a crime. Now, there were, of course, famous celebrity busts. I got a good story about Carlos Santana. He got busted coming into the States from Mexico with some cannabis. Big surprise that he would have cannabis. But he was on a tour that Anheuser-Busch had sponsored. And now they were a big proponent against cannabis, Anheuser-Busch, in the 90s. They spent a lot of money supporting anti-cannabis messaging through the Partnership for a Drug-Free America. Well, Santana was being sponsored by them on a tour where they kicked him off the tour, replaced him with another act. And then, quite funnily, Miller Beer took over the sponsorship of Santana. And his punishment for in Texas was to do community service. And he did a big free concert in a park in Philadelphia, and it turned into a smoke-in. 70,000 people came and all lit up. So things the celebrities didn't have as much to fear from being caught because they had resources. They could have lawyers. Willie Nelson was a big friend of the movement. And he actually, put his money where his mouth is and got into hemp clothing very early on. I got to ride on a bus with him a couple of times. And so they were critical, really, because people look up to celebrities and artists. And if they were saying it's cool, and especially people like Willie Nelson, who's now 90, health problems, he can still play concerts. How can you say that it's anti-motivational or harmful when these healthy, creative people that people look up to are daily users in many cases?
I agree. I wanted to ask, you briefly mentioned a minute ago, Partnership for a Drug-Free America. And I wanted to ask about, to me, that seems part of the backlash that happened to the growing, cannabis movement that was gaining momentum. Can you name some of the other backlashes, and what do you think motivated the backlash?
Yeah. Well, there are ultra conservatives that aren't libertarians that do want to interfere in people's lives. They want to tell you what religion you have to believe in and what you can't believe in. And in Florida, there was one rabid anti-drug person called Bill McCullum, who, I think he was, I can't remember now if he was ever Attorney General of Florida, but he was a congressman at the time, and he ran for the US Senate, and he was constantly against any kind of leniency on marijuana laws. In fact, he wanted to make them harsher. And so there was a conservative backlash to this. What I think eroded that was this libertarian philosophy of, why are you telling us what we can put in our body? You allow alcohol. And that was the argument to sort of use was, well, we already legally regulate many other substances for either medical use or for recreational use. You're picking on this. And I think that was part of, it was a backlash to the counterculture. And it's been the same since the 60s. There are people that still believe that the people that protested the Vietnam War were traitors. You know, Jane Fonda still gets called, you know, Red Jane or whatever it was. And it's this mentality of you have to be, and because the hippies smoked pot, because part of the anti-war movement, not all of it, but part of it were part of the counterculture that used cannabis, it was a good way to target them. You know, the Nixon administration did it, Reagan in the 80s, and it was out of the Reagan administration that came these groups like the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, Nancy Reagan, Just Say No, this big campaign. We always used to call it jokingly the Partnership for a Fact-Free America, because they would put out these studies that were done with no peer review, with really bad methodology. And we had actually the studies to debunk their studies, and actual professionals that had peer-reviewed studies done on cannabis to show that it was fairly benign. It's not to say that it's 100% healthy for every single individual. You know, smoking anything can cause some irritation to the lungs, but overall, compared to tobacco and alcohol, other perfectly legal substances, it was much, much safer. And science could show that.
Yeah, the Schaefer Commission in 1972, I remember, was a big early motivator for NORML and other groups that were around at that time. And that showed that, you know, like you said, that anything used outside of moderation is probably not a good thing for you. And that's what they showed. But, you know, all of these unempirical studies, these non-peer-reviewed information, and the whole United States seemed to have bought that from the propaganda that was put out.
Yeah, they did a horrible study on some rhesus monkeys once, where they basically put monkeys under gas masks and fed them marijuana smoke, but they fed them so much marijuana smoke, and they didn't have the masks properly adjusted to exhale or anything. So they suffocated these poor monkeys. I mean, let alone being against animal experimentation of that nature, but horrible thing. But they said, look, it suffocates and causes lung damage in monkeys. But it was nothing to do with if you to put any kind of smoke in those certain conditions. But that study continued to be cited for years and years by people, conservatives in the Partnership for Drug-Free America, even though long debunked. That's where the media came in when we got more sophisticated, was to show them what the credentials and the CVs of the doctors we were working with, you know, where they went to school, what studies they had reviewed, were they replicated and peer reviewed. And we clearly had the overwhelming scientific evidence on our side. And eventually people will see that if it's presented to them in the correct way.
I wanted to ask you, you said that you learned how to be an activist basically on the fly. That was on the job training. No one really trained you. But there had to have been some previous social movements that you looked at to, you know, get tactics or things that might work.
Definitely. I can tell you, I haven't talked too much about direct civil disobedience, but there's several people that turned themselves in for smoking marijuana, or had events where they distributed large amounts of joints for people to smoke and break the law in front of the police, in front of a courthouse. And one group was THC, Texas Hemp Coalition. They had 7 people turn themselves into the police station, all smoking marijuana, and were arrested. And each time it got more and more media attention. And they based, and we based later, learning from them, a lot of these actions on the teachings of Henry David Thoreau, who was a anti-war protester and a tax protester. Gandhi in India, doing non-violent disobedience to the British Empire to get them to leave, and MLK and the civil rights movement. Sit-ins, lunch counter sit-ins, and going to vote when you weren't allowed to vote, and blocking access to public roads. But we always, and so we did start to read that information. And then there were people like the ACLU we could turn to for advice on our legal rights. At first, they were sort of reluctant because of the stigma of, again, the drug war and cannabis. But eventually we're saying, no, we're just talking about our right to say these things and be in public spaces, organizing a rally, inviting people to come, inviting the media to come. And we wrote literally hundreds of letters over the years in the 90s to get permits to these events, and through the 2000s. And you wouldn't believe how many mayors or city council denied cannabis is illegal. You can't speak about this in our community. We don't want this drug here. And we had to file lawsuits. And so we were very lucky to meet a few, like I had a hemp museum in New Orleans where we started a southern office for the Cannabis Action Network in the early 90s. And we had a huge big sign on the side of the building, a cannabis leaf and hemp museum. And we had all of different things you could make from hemp and do, and information there and books. People could come by. And I got into an argument with the city council over the sign and the sign ordinance. Well, luckily we met a lawyer called Gary Wainwright there, who ended up doing dozens of pro bono work on cases of people who committed civil disobedience or were arrested at rallies. And he really dedicated a large part of his law practice to helping people in Texas, Florida, Louisiana. Now, these were tough places to be an activist in the South. California had already progressed, and the East Coast, but it was quite a harsh place. People were still really stuck in the 50s there in terms of their attitude to this. So, and then contacting the ACLU, we got pro bono attorneys I'll mention in Florida, Richard Wilson and Gary Ettinger, who had no stake in the marijuana movement. They were private attorneys that actually represented a lot of people on different free speech rights, sign ordinances, the right to have a strip club in a certain part of town, and the right to have a cannabis rally. And you were involved in this, Scott, where we filed many lawsuits against cities like Orlando, Jacksonville, Tampa, to have these rallies. And they actually ended up, not only our rights were upheld to have the rally, it created huge publicity so that more people came to the events. It sort of backfired on them, and it set precedent so that people, when we were talking to an organizer, perhaps in Alabama or Louisiana, maybe in Georgia, that was saying, well, I want to have a rally, but they've said no, or I'm not sure if I can. We could say, no, use this court case and tell them at the city, tell the city attorney or the city manager, whoever it is in charge, that you want this rally and here's the law. And if you don't, there might maybe legal action taken against you. And it helped sort of encourage people that were maybe, they were for us, but they were maybe a little hesitant to get involved, not sure what to do if they were told no by their local officials. So it was really, just a few attorneys that helped us do this. And we did a lot of the legwork for those cases. That's the thing. If you're going to get an attorney to work free of charge, you have to do a lot of the legwork. You have to have all of the information documented about the case. You have to have names, times, dates, copies of the documents that you've sent them, copies of the documents they've sent you, and be quite meticulous. And if you do that, a lawyer's going to continue to work for you. If you waste their time, then, so it's a matter of a lot of hard work, a lot of reading, and persistence.
That kind of marries my question about the involvement of attorneys. But one of the tactics was filing strategic lawsuits that had nothing to do with cannabis. They were all about the First Amendment, but
Yeah.
it really was about cannabis and allowed promotion of the message about cannabis legalization. That's amazing.
Yeah, and even the ones that were about cannabis, for example, the doobie tosser in Gainesville, Florida, a guy that committed civil disobedience year after year, distributing cannabis cigarettes to people in the audience. He was arrested repeatedly, and he would take his court case and appeal and all the way to the constitutionality of the law. Now, all the lawyers that were involved said, we have a very slim chance of winning this case. But we're going to do it because you create a record. And we had Jack Herrera and Dr. Morgan come and testify at these trials, even though realistic, we knew we won't win. But these trials ended up on the front page of the New York Times in some cases, and the Washington Post. So it was worth its weight in gold in free publicity. And it's really, we owe the bravery of people. I was arrested 4 different times and, threatened with jail for having hemp seeds in Texas. And I went through a 6-7 year legal battle that drained resources, but you fight and you fight. And we owe a great debt to people that were willing to put their butts on the line to get this message out. And it's not easy.
You and I would look at the movement as successful at this point. And I think most people who were involved would. But changing legislation has still been difficult. The majority of states where it's legal in the United States have been done that way because of citizen involvement and some money to put petitions and ballot initiatives together, which takes a lot of money. But legislation still is hard to come by. Why do you think that is? And there's still some states you're going to jail still.
Yeah, and the federal government is still very slow and resistant to change. The main thing, the success is that there are far fewer people being arrested for marijuana possession now than there were. I think it topped off at almost 1 million arrests a year at the peak, and it's down to much lower than that. But to me, the ultimate goal should be that every person in a household should have the right to grow their own cannabis. With a reasonable limit on the amount of plants. Perhaps some people might say 5 plants, some people might say 10 plants. But then you get big business you don't get big business out of the cannabis business, that will still exist, but people don't have to participate in it. Just like you can grow your own carrots, you don't have to go to the supermarket. If you have a place to grow carrots, you don't have to go there. It should be the same. And those are laws that I hope people are still fighting for. But the main priority is nobody should really be going to jail at all for using or possessing cannabis. I mean, and people still are. It's still being used in some states, in some places as a weapon, again, mainly against people of color or the poor.
I think Louisiana is one of those states, unfortunately.
Yeah. Even though New Orleans itself has a decrim, they don't prosecute now for simple possession in the city of New Orleans. So that's a big deal for people there, because that was always a way for the police in New Orleans to harass African Americans primarily. And at least that weapon has been taken away from the police. They find plenty of other ways, believe me, to harass minorities, which is a shame. And that's something that people should still continue to fight for, is just justice overall and an end to the war on drugs entirely.
I want to, that's all the questions I have for you, but I wanted to wrap this whole thing up by asking you, is there anything I didn't ask you that you think is important for people to know about the cannabis movement and why it was successful and what worked?
Yeah. What I would say is that be prepared for some hard work, but also don't forget to have fun. A lot of the stuff we did was civil disobedience or on the edge of civil disobedience, where we made fun of politicians. I learned a lot from the yippies. about how to attract attention to an issue by using humor and satire to get people's attention. However, once you've got people's attention, then you have to have a plan. You have to have some way to harness that energy of people. Yeah, that was funny, the making fun of the police, or that parade they did was really colorful and we laughed and we want to get involved. Then you have to have either some legislation that's pending for people to support, make a phone call. And that's the tricky part is not taking yourself too seriously, because that can get depressing. If you're always thinking, oh, this is hard work, the laws aren't changing quick enough. So you have to have fun in the move, whatever movement you're in. Doesn't matter, have some fun, go out there and have fun, but then you have to have that serious side as well. And there are people that are better at different tasks, identifying who is the serious person that's better to perhaps go and talk to the legislature. Who are the people that are better at organizing great bands to play at an event and running a sound system? And who are the people to perhaps write some artworks and cartoons that a newspaper might publish? There's all kinds of different skill sets. And trying to invite a big tent is my theory. Don't be worried because he doesn't have a suit or she doesn't have a suit. Don't exclude people because they are wearing a suit. You have to have the big tent of everybody involved, find out what people's skills are and try and coordinate people. That's really it. I mean, but don't be under any illusion that whatever you're trying to change will change tomorrow because you had a rally. It takes persistence and
it's a campaign.
Things don't change overnight. They change slowly over decades of time and work.
And it took a long time for the cannabis industry. I think in my interview with Keith Strop, he said, had he known at the beginning how long it was going to take and how much effort was going to be required, he said he might look for something else back then.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think that any movement is like that.
Yeah. Look, people were fighting for the rights of women to vote, less than 100 years ago. And women don't have fully equal rights in most countries in the world. There may be a few exceptions where they do. Scandinavia is pretty close, I think. But you've got African Americans and brown people in the United States and immigrants are still heavily discriminated against in housing, education, loans. It's still going on. Things have gotten better, but that doesn't mean that if you're in the shoes of a young kid growing up in a minority family in an urban area of America, that you have full equal rights. You don't. And it still needs to be addressed. And thank goodness for people that do, groups like Black Lives Matter that are out there putting their message out and putting their freedom on the line to talk about this.
Yeah, they experience some of the very same things. Way different movement. I think, the involvement of mass social media, it was a different organization than what we experienced. But I think that the cannabis movement can serve as a model, at least some of the things that were learned, so they don't have to learn on the fly, like we did. And yeah.
Sure. I did a campaign on sex education actually in Brevard County in Florida, where they had these far right religious groups coming into the schools to teach abstinence. That weren't allowed to use condoms. There was no talk about HIV, no public health message at all, just a religious message, and it was illegal. And we had to get the school board to overturn, to throw those people out and actually put a more comprehensive sex education curriculum in place. That took about 18 months of work just to get a school board to change its mind.
Something that's a no-brainer, actually.
Right, it should be. But after that, along with some colleagues at the ACLU that helped fund our campaign there, we put together a community organizing manual that based on that, what did we do? All of the tactics that we used, and how did we counter opposition and so forth and that. But that's in print. It's not been scanned and put up online yet. It's several hundred pages, but it's very detailed, and it serves as that. So one of these days, I'll have to have someone help me scan it and put it on a PDF or something. But there's lots of documents. I've got a suitcase full of them. I'm sure you have documents. I'm sure other activists around the country. But perhaps it's a project for the future, is to have some sort of clearinghouse website for some of the legal cases, perhaps some of the
Good idea.
training manuals that we've done over the years, because we did a lot of booklets on know your rights, those sort of things. Know your First Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights, what to do if someone wants to search you, etc. But I think a lot of that, I don't know how much exists on social media of that stuff and that information now, but it's something to look into maybe.
Sure. Kevin, I'm going to end the interview there. We can still visit if you're down for that, but I'm going to stop the recording of the video. And I really appreciate your insight and your time. And I think that you have invaluable knowledge. And like you said, it's not just in those documents, though. I think you have invaluable knowledge up here to be shared and admired and modeled. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Is the recording